So this is going to be the last story I'm sharing from this book. The universe is a Huckleberry Jam Uncrustable, and I'll put a link to the full page of all the Lulu books. Um, this one has, as a side note, this one has some stories that have um, violence or themes of mental illness or drugs. So I've put an explicit content warning on it. It's not um, overly violent or pornographic or anything. It's just I didn't think it was appropriate for people under 18. Again, the universe is a Huckleberry Jam Uncrustable. And this story is David Returns to Earth. David had traveled to Alpha Centauri, Zeta Prime, Betelgeuse, and for the past 22 years of his life, gone wherever his whims took him. He had learned all he needed from his laptop, his AI companion, and from talking to the stars that floated in the sky. But he was now 27 and his mother had sent him an urgent call to come home immediately, or he would be late for dinner once again, and accordingly, he would be grounded. And although David had missed over 20 years of dinners, he was a good boy who always did what his mother asked. And so he went to Earth immediately. David remembered vaguely what Earth was like. He remembered school, boring. The people there, uninteresting. And the food, so bland. And he really wanted to stay in space, which was 100 times better, but he felt obligated to return. So, David turned on the matter extrapolator, made himself some hot chocolate, and created some plutonium fuel to feed into his spaceship. The spaceship only required a small amount, and so that is all he made. And when he fed it into the matter discombobulator, a few nanoseconds later, his spaceship was cruising through a wormhole, free of the constraints of the speed of light or the troubles of thermophysical fusion. David's spaceship traveled through a Schrodinger's tesseract and touched down on Earth, where he walked out onto the surface of the planet, finding himself in Arkansas. It had been so long since he had been on Earth, he was in awe of the green plants that spread all around under his feet. He introduced himself in 13 interdimensional languages to the grass, but then remembered that wasn't really necessary, and he just continued walking on it. He had forgotten exactly where his house was, so he walked down a random street in the random town he had landed in. A young woman ran to David and hugged him. She said she always loved him, that she was waiting for him, and that she needed him. To David, she seemed overly emotional and illogical, and so he did the same thing he did when he met any illogical species. He said, "I mean you no harm," into his translator, which would then relay the message to this young woman, and then he went on his way. She didn't seem to much appreciate this gesture of his. She spat into his translator and made gestures at him. But David just smiled politely and waved as he walked away. David walked up and down streets that seemed vaguely familiar. He was not worried about police since he had been free of police through all of his space travels. But now that he was wandering the streets as a strange 27-year-old in a spacesuit, the police eventually appeared regardless. David waved and smiled and said hello to the police, who in turn asked him for identification. David was confused and laughed since he had never been asked for his identification, and he started to turn and walk away once more. The police didn't quite like this and produced a taser, which electrocuted David. David, in his magnificent spacesuit, did not feel much, just a slight tingle, and asked the police not to do such things. The police again asked for his identification, and David said that he had none, that his name was David, and he had been soaring among the stars for just about his entire life. The police did not believe David, and they produced big guns and pointed them at David. David told them that shooting him would be a mistake since his spaceship would retaliate. The policemen rolled their eyes and trained their guns on David. David smiled and said, "I really must warn you, my spaceship is not happy." David could hear the bleeps and blorps of disapproval. The policemen, nevertheless, again rolled their eyes and started to fire warning shots, and almost instantly David's spaceship evaporated the police. David sighed and continued walking down the street. "I am sorry," he said to the place where the police were, "but you were warned." David then continued walking down the street. Luckily, his spaceship realized that he was walking around aimlessly and told David that he used to live in Seattle and that he was currently in Little Rock. David laughed and went into the spaceship, which took him to Seattle. It only took a third of a second. "Just go down this street, past the Fremont Troll, and you won't be late for dinner." David thanked the computer for the information and started walking. As he walked, he noticed people noticing him. They were all wearing fleece shirts or windbreakers while he was still in his space suit. He decided that this must seem odd and pressed a button in order to transform into more typical earthly fashion. David, however, misjudged just what was normal earthly fashion, and instead of simply noticing him, people were laughing openly. It seems David had put on earthly fashion, a turtleneck and a skirt, but they were on the wrong part of his body. After this ordeal, David grinned broadly to try to calm the people of Seattle, but they only found him even more strange and started running and screaming. However, upon seeing a cyan and magenta house, David smiled because he knew that at last he was home. He went up to the door and was about to ring the doorbell when David's mother opened the door and told him, "You are already late, and the chocolate stew is burnt." But David's mother, Davidina was her name, sighed and told David that he was just in time for dessert, asparagus cake. David told his family all about his travels over dessert. His parents are happy and tell him they wish they were younger, and David says that the technology in the spaceship can fix that. You see, the tech started out quite advanced, but after traveling to dozens of advanced cultures, its abilities expanded greatly. It can reverse aging, create food from matter, create limitless energy, and more. David's parents smiled, but David sensed they were skeptical. David then told his parents about his run-in with the woman and the police. His parents were very upset about the police, to which David assured them it was sad, but also unavoidable. Dad sighed and said that all the technology in the world can't clear up something like that. David frowned, and David's dad, whose name was David O, sat and frowned too. But then, just as he had a million times before in his life, David O had a brilliant solution, and this time it wasn't a new technology or even a way to reverse time. "What will you do then?" David asked. David O said that he would simply replicate money and pay off the police. David and his parents slept soundly that night, and Davidina got herself a blepharoplasty and tummy tuck and anti-aging treatment before breakfast. The next day, David's dad told David that he would need to get a job if he were to stay on Earth. David couldn't understand why, with all the spaceship's technology, that this was needed. "We must keep up appearances," David's dad said. So David sighed and he started working on his resume. But David's dad stopped him. "No need to do that," he said. I have a job waiting for you." And with that, David O pushed David out the door and pointed him towards Wallingford, and David started walking. David came upon a big blue store and was welcomed inside by a big man with a smile as big as his face. He was taken to a room with 32 TVs and every video game known to man, and was told to enjoy himself. And when the end of the workday came, he could go home. But in the meantime, just enjoy yourself some diet soda and play anything you like. David didn't like not working while others worked and wished he could be out among the stars once more, traveling through space and time, reversing and re-reversing gravity and making matter into antimatter. But if that wasn't feasible, he figured the least he could do was make all the other workers' lives better. So, that night, David snuck on board his spaceship and told the computer to broadcast its technologies to all people of the Earth. Once you do that, David said, everyone will have an infinite matter creator, a time dilator, and access to time distortion and preservation. We will all be as rich as kings and can play video games and travel the stars all night and day. And, sure enough, the next day, when all the people of the world had access to the time traveling and free food and free travel, as they wanted, things started to look up. Progress seemed imminent and assured. But then David's dad shamed him. You shouldn't have done that, he said. You have made everyone equal. But pretty soon, some people are just going to say that they are more equal than others. And, sure enough, the next day, as billions of people were blasting into space, a lone genius in Africa discovered a previously unknown capability of David's technology, and found he could not only travel through time, but inside of it, not only make matter out of nothing, but make antimatter as well, and could create white holes out of black ones. He made himself king of all, and all were made to serve him. David sighed as he returned home for dinner. Tonight they were having roasted coffee and garlic pie with a side of banana and turmeric pizza. David began to wish he had never come home at all. No time for regrets, David-O said to David after dessert. We have to fix this. And David-O grabbed David's arm and they both entered into the past. But how can we fix this problem? David whined. No matter how far back we go, the smartest person in the world has surely already thought of it. Well, David said, that is why in times like this, we have a safety valve. What does it do? David asked. David-O smiled. Just press it. So David pressed it and a huge hammer fell on his head. Ow, David said. How is this going to help? When things get this bad, a hammer is the only way to fix things, David-O said. If you destroy the time manipulator, it should set things back to how they were before all this nonsense. David sighed. He knew that if this worked, his life would be immeasurably boring, and he would probably have to get a real job. But on the other hand, he would not have to worry about the inevitable destruction of all of time-space by the now self-proclaimed king. David raised the hammer high and swung, and then suddenly, all turned white. David found himself floating in space, several weeks before all of this happened. And he decided he would never return to Earth again.